My mother did not ask me if I wanted to give my brother a kidney. She simply handed me a folder with my pre-surgery blood work appointment already scheduled for the following Tuesday, like she was reminding me about a dentist visit. I remember standing in the kitchen of the house I grew up in a small town outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, holding that folder in my hands and feeling the floor tilt underneath me, because for 26 years I had somehow convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, my body still belonged to me. I was wrong. That folder told me everything I needed to know about my place in that family, and by Thursday night I had a suitcase packed, a one-way ticket to Lisbon, Portugal purchased with money I had been quietly saving for 3 years, and a note left on the kitchen table that simply said, "I am sorry, but I cannot give away parts of myself anymore." 3 years later, my phone rang at 4 in the morning, and it was my mother, sobbing and screaming from a hospital hallway, begging me to come home immediately. And when I finally spoke, after 3 years of silence, I whispered 6 words that made her go completely quiet on the other end of the line. "I am not your spare parts." If you had told me when I was 8 years old that my entire identity would one day be reduced to a matching blood type and a set of healthy organs, I would not have understood what you meant. But I would have felt it in my bones anyway, because even then, I somehow knew that I was not loved the same way my brother was loved. My name is Danica Whitfield, and this is the story of how my family tried to turn me into a human spare parts store for my older brother Bryson, and how I finally found the courage to say no, even when saying no meant losing the only family I had ever known. To understand how we got to that kitchen table, you have to go back to when I was born, because I did not come into this world by accident, and I did not come into this world purely out of love either, not entirely. My brother Bryson was 4 years old when doctors discovered he had a rare congenital kidney disorder called Alport syndrome, a genetic condition that slowly destroys kidney function over time. My parents, Faye and Walt Whitfield, were devastated. They spent months in and out of specialists' offices in Iowa City, driving back and forth from our small town, watching their only son face a future of dialysis, transplants, and a shortened life expectancy. And somewhere in the middle of that terror, a doctor mentioned, almost in passing, that having another biological child could one day provide a compatible kidney donor if needed, since siblings often share better tissue matches than unrelated donors. My mother has told this story to relatives over the years like it was a beautiful, hopeful moment, the moment she decided to have another baby, to have me. She has never once, in all my life, told it like it was a decision about a person. She told it like it was a decision about a backup plan. I was born 18 months after that conversation. I have seen the pictures, I have heard the stories, and I want to be fair, because for the first few years of my life, I do not think anyone was cruel to me on purpose. I was a baby, and babies get held and fed and loved simply for existing. But even in my earliest memories, I remember the doctor visits. I remember being 3 years old, sitting on a cold exam table in a paper gown, while a nurse drew blood from my arm, and my mother standing in the doorway not comforting me, but asking the doctor, "Is she still a match? Will she still work if we need her?" I did not understand the words then, but I understood the tone. I understood that whatever they were asking about mattered more than whether I was scared of the needle. By the time I was 7, I had been through more blood draws, tissue typing tests, and medical evaluations than most adults go through in a lifetime. My parents called it just being careful, a precaution in case Bryson's kidneys ever failed completely and he needed a transplant. What they never called it, not once, was optional. I was never asked if I wanted to be tested. I was simply told to hold still, to be brave, to think about how much my brother needed me. Bryson, for his part, was not a villain in this story, at least not at first. He was a sick kid who genuinely adored his little sister, who used to sneak me candy when Mom said I couldn't have sweets before dinner, who used to let me sleep in his room during thunderstorms because I was terrified of lightning. I loved my brother. I still love my brother, in the complicated, aching way you love someone who was never given the tools to see you as a full person either. But as we grew older, the dynamic in our house calcified into something I can only describe now as a caste system, with Bryson's health at the top and everything else, including me, arranged beneath it. My father worked long hours as a machinist at a manufacturing plant, and he was a quiet man, not unkind but conflict-averse to the point of near invisibility. He let my mother run the household, and my mother ran it like a woman perpetually at war with an invisible enemy trying to take her son from her. Every family decision, every vacation, every dinner conversation orbited around Bryson's kidney function numbers. I learned words like creatinine and GFR and proteinuria before I learned long division. I learned to read the tightness in my mother's shoulders that meant Bryson's last labs had come back worse. And I learned to make myself small and quiet on those nights, because there was no room in that house for anyone else's needs when Bryson's kidneys were struggling. I want to tell you about a specific day because I think it captures everything you need to understand about my childhood. I was 11 years old, and it was the day of my school's spring choir concert, the first time I had ever gotten a solo. I had practiced for weeks. I remember standing backstage in my navy blue dress, my stomach in knots, scanning the audience for my family. My father was there, sitting in the third row, looking exhausted but present. My mother was not there. She was at Iowa City with Bryson, because he had a follow-up appointment that had been rescheduled for that exact evening, and rather than ask the clinic to move it again, my mother decided that Bryson's appointment mattered more than my solo. I sang my solo to a half-empty auditorium, feeling my father's proud, apologetic eyes on me, and when we got home that night, my mother asked me, distractedly, "How was your little concert thing?" Before immediately launching into a detailed account of Bryson's new lab numbers. I was 11, and I already understood, in some wordless, bone-deep way, that I was the understudy in my own family's story. By the time I was 16, Bryson's kidney function had declined enough that dialysis became a real possibility within the next few years, and the word transplant started appearing in our house with increasing frequency, spoken in hushed, hopeful tones by my mother like it was a sacred word. And every single time that word was spoken, my mother's eyes would find me across the room. Not Bryson's, not my father's, mine. I did not need her to say it out loud, because I already understood the arithmetic of my existence. I had been born, in part, to be a contingency plan, and now the contingency was becoming reality. I want to be clear that I was never legally forced into anything as a minor. My parents never tried to have me tested for actual donor compatibility surgery while I was underage, mostly because the doctors made clear that a living donor had to be an adult who could give informed consent. But that legal protection did nothing to protect me from years of psychological conditioning, from a mother who would look at me during family dinners and say things like, "You're so lucky you're healthy, Danica. God gave you those healthy kidneys for a reason." As though my organs were a loan from the universe that came with an expected repayment plan. When I turned 18, the conversations shifted from hypothetical to explicit. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, the same table where 3 years ago I would find that folder waiting for me, and my mother sliding a pamphlet across to me titled, "Living Kidney Donation: What Siblings Should Know." I was 18 years old, I had just graduated high school, and my mother was handing me donor pamphlets instead of college brochures. I remember looking up at her and asking, carefully, testing the water, "Mom, what if I'm not a match? What if my kidneys aren't healthy enough?" And I will never forget the look on her face, a flash of genuine panic before she said, "Don't even joke about that, Danica. You have to be healthy. You have to take care of yourself for your brother." Not for myself, for my brother. I want you to understand that at no point during any of this did anyone in my family ever ask me a simple question. "Danica, how do you feel about potentially donating an organ to your brother one day?" Nobody ever asked me if I was scared. Nobody ever asked me if I had dreams of my own that a major surgery and lifelong health monitoring might complicate. Nobody ever asked me if I even wanted to be a mother myself one day and whether losing a kidney might affect that. I was simply an asset on a ledger, a resource to be preserved and eventually harvested. I moved away for college to the University of Minnesota, partly to study communications, and partly, if I am honest with myself now, to put physical distance between myself and that house. Those 4 years were the first time in my life I got to exist as just Danica, not Danica the backup kidney, and I loved it fiercely. I made friends who knew nothing about Bryson's medical history. I dated a sweet, awkward engineering student named Desmond Ockhafer for 2 years, someone W. Ho made me laugh so hard I would cry, someone who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm just to bring me soup when I had the flu. For 4 years, I got to practice being a whole person, and I loved who I was becoming. But every holiday, every summer break, I went home, and every time I went home, the machinery of my family's expectations would grind back into motion. Bryson's kidney function continued its slow decline through my college years, dropping further with each passing year, and by the time I graduated at 22, doctors were telling my parents that a transplant would likely be necessary within the next 3 to 5 years, sooner if his numbers kept trending the way they were. My mother began, subtly at first, then less subtly, referring to me as Bryson's best hope. Not a sister, not a person with her own trajectory, a hope, a resource, a plan. I moved to Chicago after college, took a job in marketing at a mid-sized advertising firm, and started building a life that felt, for the first time, entirely mine. I got my own apartment in Logan Square, adopted a scrappy gray tabby cat named Biscuit, started training for my first half marathon. I made friends I actually chose, rather than family I was assigned. And still, the phone calls from home continued, my mother's voice always carrying that same undertone of urgency and expectation, always asking about my health, my diet, whether I was drinking enough water, whether I had been to a doctor recently. Questions that on the surface sounded like a mother's care, but that I had learned, through 2 decades of experience, were actually about kidney preservation. I was 24 when I started seeing a therapist for the first time, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Priscilla Okonkwo, and it was in her small office on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue that I first said out loud, to another human being, the sentence that had been circling my mind for years. I think my parents only had me so I could save my brother's life someday. I remember crying so hard after I said it that I could barely breathe, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it privately never had. Priscilla did not flinch. She did not tell me I was overreacting, or that my parents surely loved me too. She simply asked me, gently, "And how does that sentence feel, sitting inside your body?" And I told her it felt like being erased. Over the next 2 years, Priscilla helped me understand something crucial, that my anger was valid, but more than that I had every right to make a fully autonomous decision about my own body when the time came, regardless of what my family expected of me. She helped me understand that love which comes with conditions, that only shows up fully when you are useful, is not the kind of love a person should have to earn through the sacrifice of their own body. I started, slowly, to build boundaries. I stopped answering every single call from my mother immediately. I started limiting visits home to shorter windows. I started, for the first time in my life, prioritizing my own well-being over my family's demands, and it felt like learning to walk again after an injury, clumsy and terrifying and necessary. Then, when I was 26, everything came to a head. Bryson's kidney function had dropped to the point where his nephrologist told my parents that dialysis would likely begin within months, and that a living donor transplant, ideally from a sibling, would give him dramatically better long-term outcomes than a deceased donor kidney or years on dialysis. I remember getting the phone call from my mother, and for the first time in this entire saga, she actually said the words out loud, directly to me, instead of just implying them for 2 decades. "Danica, we need you to come home this weekend. We need to talk about getting you tested to be Bryson's donor. Not, would you be willing to consider? Not, how do you feel about this? We need you to come home," as though I were a spare tire being retrieved from storage. I drove home that weekend with my stomach in knots, and I told myself I would set a boundary, that I would tell my mother I needed time to think, that this was a massive decision requiring genuine consideration, not an obligation to be fulfilled on command. But when I walked into that kitchen, exhausted from the 4-hour drive, my mother was standing there with a folder in her hands, and she slid it across the table to me the same way she had slid that donor pamphlet years earlier, except this time, when I opened it, my stomach dropped through the floor. Inside was a pre-admission paperwork packet from the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics, with my name already printed on it, a scheduled date for compatibility bloodwork the following Tuesday, and a tentative surgical consultation date penciled in for 3 weeks later. My mother had already called the hospital. She had already started the administrative process of scheduling me for donor surgery, without a single conversation with me first, without so much as asking whether I was even willing to be tested. I remember staring at that paperwork, my hands shaking, and asking her in a voice that came out smaller than I wanted it to, "Mom, did you schedule this without asking me?" And my mother, without an ounce of shame in her voice, looked at me and said, "Danica, we don't have time to wait around for you to have feelings about this. Your brother is dying. I did what any mother would do." I asked her what would happen if I said no, if I decided I did not want to donate, and my mother's face twisted into an expression I will never forget as long as I live, somewhere between disbelief and disgust, and she said, "Why would you say no? You were born for this. This is exactly why we had you. Not, we hope you'll consider it. Not, we would be so grateful. We had you for this." 26 years of unspoken suspicion crystallized into 6 words that shattered whatever fragile illusion I had left about my place in that family. My father was sitting at the table too, silent as always, staring at his coffee mug, and I looked at him, desperate for anyone, to acknowledge that what my mother had just said was monstrous, and he simply said, quietly, "Danica, honey, your brother needs you." Not a defense of me. Not even a gentle acknowledgement that this was a lot to ask. Just another voice adding weight to the scale that had never once in 26 years tipped in my favor. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, running through every memory of my life. The blood draws at 3 years old, the missed choir concert, the donor pamphlets at 18, and I realized, with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness, that if I did not leave that house, if I did not remove myself entirely from my family's orbit, I was going to end up on an operating table having a kidney removed from my body, because I had never once been given the tools or the permission to say the word no. And even if some part of me might have eventually chosen, freely, to help my brother, the fact that this choice had been stolen from me before I ever had the chance to make it, the fact that my mother had scheduled my body for surgery like she was booking a haircut, told me everything I needed to know about how little my consent had ever mattered in that house. I want to be honest, because I have thought about this moment for years since, and I do not think my anger was really about the kidney itself. If someone had come to me and said, "Danica, your brother is dying, would you be willing to consider being tested as a donor?" I think, honestly, there is a real chance I would have said yes, because despite everything, I loved my brother, and some part of me still does. My anger was about the theft of the choice itself. My anger was about 26 years of being told, in 1,000 small ways, that my body existed as a resource for someone else's survival, rather than as something that belonged entirely to me. By Thursday of that week, I had made a decision that felt, in the moment, both terrifying and like the only sane response to an insane situation. I had, for 3 years by that point, been quietly saving money, not because I had planned to run away, but simply because Priscilla had encouraged me to build a private financial cushion, an emergency fund that was entirely mine, separate from any joint accounts or family obligations. I had almost $11,000 saved. I looked up flights that same night and found a one-way ticket to Lisbon, Portugal, a city I had visited once during a college study abroad trip and had fallen in love with, a city where I knew absolutely no one, where nobody had ever heard the name Bryson Whitfield, where nobody would ever look at me and see a walking spare parts inventory. I did not tell my parents I was leaving the country. I did not tell Bryson either, though I agonized over that decision more than any other, because whatever else was true, Bryson had not orchestrated this, my mother had, and some part of me still wanted to protect him from the fallout of my departure. I packed one large suitcase and one carry-on, the same way I imagine people pack when they are fleeing something, taking only what truly mattered: photographs, my laptop, a few pieces of jewelry from my grandmother, my passport. I left the pre-admission paperwork sitting untouched on the kitchen table, and next to it, I left a note, handwritten, that I must have rewritten 6 or 7 times before I settled on the final version. It said, "Mom and Dad, I love Bryson, and I am so sorry he is sick, but I cannot keep living as a body that exists only to be harvested when needed. I need you to understand that I am a person, not a spare parts inventory. I have to go be somewhere I can figure out who I am outside of what my body can give to someone else. Please do not try to find me right away. I need time, Danica." I left for the airport at 4 in the morning, before either of my parents woke up, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. I remember sitting in the departure gate at Chicago O'Hare, my phone buzzing incessantly in my pocket as my mother, apparently having found the note, began calling and texting in an escalating spiral of confusion, anger, and eventually, panic. I turned my phone off entirely somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, and when I turned it back on 2 days later, after I had checked into a small, sunlit rental apartment in the Alfama district of Lisbon, I had 47 missed calls and over 100 text messages, ranging from "Danica, where are you, this isn't funny," to "How could you do this to your brother?" to, finally, days later, a single message from my father that simply said, "I understand if you needed to go. I hope you're safe." That message, more than anything, is what got me through the first terrifying weeks of building a new life alone in a foreign country. I will not pretend that leaving was easy, or that the guilt did not follow me across the ocean like a shadow I could never quite outrun. For the first 6 months in Lisbon, I woke up many nights in a cold sweat, convinced I had made a monstrous, selfish decision, that somewhere back in Iowa my brother was suffering because I had refused to save him. I found a therapist in Lisbon, an American expat named Miriam Ashworth Blackwood, who specialized in working with people processing family estrangement. And in our sessions, week after week, I slowly began to untangle the difference between guilt that reflects genuine wrongdoing and guilt that has simply been trained into you by decades of manipulation. Miriam helped me understand that Bryson's illness was not my responsibility to solve with my own body. That compassion for someone's suffering does not obligate you to sacrifice yourself for them, especially not when that sacrifice has been extracted through decades of psychological conditioning rather than freely given. I built a life in Lisbon that slowly began to feel entirely my own. I found work first as a freelance marketing consultant for American companies looking to break into European markets, using the skills I had built in Chicago, and within a year I had enough steady clients to support myself comfortably. I learned Portuguese, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, until I could hold entire conversations with the elderly woman who ran the pasteleria on my street corner, who took to saving me the last pastel de nata of the morning, because she knew I walked by every day at exactly 9:15. I made friends, real friends, chosen entirely without any connection to my family's history. A vibrant, funny Brazilian woman named Yasmin Carvalho, who worked at a design studio nearby, and a British transplant named Rowan Ashby, who ran a small bookshop, and who eventually, slowly, became something more than a friend to me. The first person I had ever dated who knew the entire ugly truth of my family history and loved me anyway. Precisely because of who I had chosen to become, rather than what my body could provide to anyone. I did stay in contact, sparingly, with my father, who would email me every few months, careful, gentle updates that never pressured me to return, that simply let me know Bryson had started dialysis, that my mother was struggling, that he missed me but respected my need for space. I did not respond to my mother at all during those first 18 months, not out of cruelty, but because every time I tried to draft a response, I found myself shaking with old, familiar anxiety, and Miriam helped me understand that I did not owe my mother access to me simply because she demanded it. Eventually, around the 2-year mark, I began exchanging occasional emails with my mother, 2 brief, careful messages, nothing that touched on the subject of donation, simply updates about weather and small, safe details of daily life, a fragile bridge rebuilt one plank at a time. I want to tell you something important here, because I think it matters for understanding what came next. During those 3 years abroad, I did not simply run from my problems and pretend my brother did not exist. I thought about Bryson constantly. I grieved, in my own way, for the relationship we might have had if we had both been allowed to exist as full people rather than as patient and potential donor. I sent him a letter, about a year into my time in Lisbon, a long, honest letter explaining why I had left, not blaming him for our mother's actions, but explaining that I needed him to understand that my absence was not a rejection of him as a brother, but a rejection of the role I had been assigned before I was even born. Bryson wrote back, eventually, a short, halting letter that told me he understood more than I might expect, that he too had spent years feeling like our mother's anxiety about his illness had swallowed up any chance either of us had at a normal childhood, that he had never asked to be the center of that kind of desperate, suffocating attention any more than I had asked to be recruited as his backup plan. That letter cracked something open in me, a recognition that Bryson and I had both, in different ways, been victims of the same dynamic, even if the burdens had landed on us so differently. 3 years passed this way, my life abroad slowly deepening into something rich and genuinely mine, my relationship with Rowan growing steadier, my friendship with Yasmin becoming one of the most important relationships of my life, my freelance business expanding to the point where I hired my first part-time assistant. I had built, from nothing, a version of myself that existed entirely outside my family's expectations. And for the first time since childhood, I felt like a whole person rather than a walking contingency plan. And then, 3 years almost to the week since I had left that note on the kitchen table, my phone rang at 4 in the morning Lisbon time, which meant it was 10 at night in Iowa, and I saw my mother's name on the screen for the first time attempting a call in months. I almost let it go to voicemail out of old instinct, but some old thread of connection I could not quite sever, made me answer. My mother was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her at first, her words tumbling out in broken, panicked fragments, and slowly I pieced together what was happening. Bryson was in the hospital in Iowa City in critical condition. His dialysis access had failed catastrophically, some kind of infection had set in, and his kidney function, already devastated by years of disease, had crashed entirely. The doctors were telling my parents that without an emergency transplant, and soon, Bryson's chances of survival were dropping by the day. My mother, through her sobs, was begging me, screaming almost, to come home immediately to get tested, to save my brother's life before it was too late. I sat there on the edge of my bed in my Lisbon apartment, the early morning light just beginning to creep through the shutters, Rowan stirring awake beside me, sensing something was wrong, and I felt something inside me that I did not expect to feel, which was not panic, and not guilt in the old, familiar, suffocating way, but a strange, clear calm. 3 years of therapy, 3 years of building a self that existed outside of anyone else's need, had given me something I did not have at 26, which was the ability to hold my compassion for my brother's suffering and my clarity about my own autonomy in the same hand without one collapsing into the other. I let my mother finish, let her get through the entire torrent of panic and pleading, and when she finally paused, gasping for breath, waiting for my answer, I said the 6 words that I had, without fully realizing it, been rehearsing for 3 years, the words that finally, completely, described the truth of who I was and who I refused to be reduced to ever again. I am not your spare parts. There was a silence on the other end of the line so total that for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then my mother made a sound I had never heard her make before, something between a gasp and a sob, and she said, "Danica, please, your brother is dying. How can you say that to me right now?" And I told her, in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, that I loved Bryson, that I was devastated to hear he was so sick, that I would call the hospital directly to speak with his doctors and understand the medical situation myself, but that I would not be bullied, guilted, or ambushed into a decision about my own body the way I had been 3 years earlier. I told her that if I chose to be tested as a donor, and it was a real possibility that I might, it would be because I made that choice freely, as an adult, with full information and full autonomy, not because she scheduled a surgery behind my back and told me I existed for no other reason than to save my brother. My mother tried, in that call and in several calls over the following days, to fall back into old patterns, to guilt me, to remind me of everything she had sacrificed raising Bryson, to accuse me of abandoning my family when they needed me most. But something had shifted permanently in me during those 3 years, and her old weapons no longer landed the way they once had. I told her, calmly but firmly, that I would fly home, not because she had commanded it, but because I chose to, because I wanted to see my brother and understand his medical situation directly from his doctors, on my own terms. I flew back to Iowa 4 days later, my stomach in knots the entire flight, Rowan having offered to come with me for support, though I asked him to wait, wanting to face this first chapter of reunion on my own. We NT straight from the airport to the hospital in Iowa City, and walking down that familiar hallway, smelling that particular hospital smell of antiseptic and fear, felt like stepping directly back into the nightmare I had fled 3 years earlier. Except this time I walked in with a version of myself that could not be as easily bent. I found my mother in the family waiting area outside the ICU, looking older than I remembered, gray threading heavily through her hair now, dark circles carved deep beneath her eyes. She stood up when she saw me, and for a moment neither of us said anything, 3 years of silence and hurt and complicated love hanging in the air between us. She reached for me, and I let her hug me, stiffly at first, and I felt her whole body shaking with sobs against me. My father emerged from the ICU a moment later, and the sight of him, thinner, grayer, more worn than I remembered, broke something loose in my chest. And I found myself crying too, 3 years of distance collapsing suddenly into the raw, uncomplicated fact that these were still, somehow, my parents. I spoke directly with Bryson's medical team that first day, insisting on hearing the full clinical picture myself rather than through my mother's panicked filter. What I learned complicated the entire situation in a way I had not expected. Bryson's condition was serious, genuinely critical, but the emergency was primarily about the infected dialysis access and sepsis risk, not an immediate need for transplant surgery that very week, as my mother's panicked phone call had implied. The doctors explained that once the infection was controlled, a new dialysis access would need to be placed, and that a living donor transplant would meaningfully improve Bryson's long-term prognosis, but that this was a conversation for the coming weeks and months, not an emergency requiring my body on an operating table within days. My mother, in her terror, had once again collapsed a complicated medical reality into a singular, desperate demand aimed at me, the way she always had. I went in to see Bryson that evening, once he was stable enough for visitors, and walking into that room, seeing my brother so thin and pale against the hospital sheets, tubes and monitors surrounding him, I felt the old grief and love for him rise up entirely uncomplicated by our mother's manipulations. He opened his eyes when I walked in, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other, 3 years and an ocean of distance between us, collapsing into the simple fact of 2 siblings who had survived the same impossible childhood in different ways. "You came," he said, his voice raspy and weak. "I came to see you," I told him, sitting down carefully in the chair beside his bed. "Not because Mom scheduled anything, because I wanted to see my brother." Bryson closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there were tears in them. "I never wanted this for you," he said. "Any of it. The testing, the pressure, all of it. I used to lie awake as a kid feeling sick about the way mom talked about you, like you were, I don't know, an insurance policy instead of my sister. I held his hand, careful of the IV line taped there, and told him that I knew that now, that his letter 3 years ago had meant more to me than he probably realized, that whatever happened with his medical care going forward, I needed him to understand that I loved him as my brother, not as a patient I was obligated to save. Over the following 2 weeks, while Bryson's infection was brought under control and his condition stabilized, I stayed in Iowa, though I stayed at a hotel rather than my parents' house, a boundary that caused visible friction with my mother, but one I refused to abandon. I spent that time in long, difficult, necessary conversations with my parents, conversations Priscilla and Miriam had both, over the years, helped me prepare for without ever knowing exactly when they would happen. I told my mother directly, in a way I had never had the courage or the security to do before I left, exactly how her decisions throughout my childhood had made me feel, the blood draws, the missed concert, the donor pamphlet at 18, the scheduled surgery I never consented to. I watched her face move through defensiveness, denial, and finally, slowly, something that looked almost like genuine horror at hearing her own actions reflected back to her through her daughter's eyes. My mother did not transform overnight into a different person, and I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this are more useful when they resist the temptation of a too tidy ending. She cried, she apologized in fragments. She also, more than once during those difficult conversations, slipped back into old patterns, reminding me of Bryson's suffering as though it were an argument against my right to boundaries. But something had genuinely shifted, both because I refused to collapse under those LD pressures the way I once had, and because, I think, the terror of nearly losing her son, combined with the terror of having already lost her daughter for 3 years, had cracked open something in her that pure comfort never had. I did eventually agree to be tested for compatibility as a kidney donor for Bryson, and I want to be very clear about why, because the distinction matters enormously to me. I did not agree because my mother demanded it, or because guilt finally wore me down, or because I felt I owed my existence to my brother's survival. I agreed because, sitting with my own therapist over video calls during those 2 weeks, and sitting with Bryson directly, hearing him tell me honestly that he would understand completely if I said no, that he had spent 3 years hoping I had built a life far away from all of this precisely because he wanted that for me, I made a genuinely free choice, as an adult woman with her own life in Lisbon, her own relationship with Rowan waiting for her, her own thriving business, to explore whether I might want to help my brother, on my terms, at my pace, with full information, and with the absolute right to change my mind at any point without losing my family's love. The testing revealed that I was, in fact, a strong compatibility match, and after weeks of careful consideration, therapy sessions, long conversations with Rowan about what this would mean for our life together, and repeated, explicit conversations with Bryson's medical team about the actual risks and realities of donation, I made the decision to move forward with the surgery, roughly 4 months after that 4 in the morning phone call. But this time, every step of that process happened because I chose it, on a timeline I controlled, with my own lawyer reviewing the consent paperwork to make sure nothing could ever again be scheduled behind my back, with Rowan flying in from Lisbon to be by my side through the entire process, with my father, for the first time in his life, actually stepping forward to advocate fiercely for my well-being throughout the surgical planning, telling my mother in front of me that this time, things would be done my way or not at all. The surgery took place at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics on a bright, cold morning in March, and I remember, in the moments before I was wheeled back, looking at my mother's face and seeing, for the first time in my entire life, an expression that looked like she genuinely saw me, not as a resource, not as a contingency plan, but as her daughter, making an extraordinary sacrifice out of love rather than obligation. The surgery went smoothly. My kidney found a healthy new home in my brother's body, and his recovery, over the following months, exceeded even the optimistic projections his medical team had offered. I want to end this story honestly, because I think the most important part of what happened is not the surgery itself, but everything that changed around it. I went back to Lisbon 4 months after the surgery, once I had fully recovered, and my life there continued, richer now for having finally, truly closed the loop on the wound that had shaped my entire childhood. Rowan and I got married the following spring, in a small ceremony overlooking the Tagus River, and my parents flew out for it, my mother crying through the entire ceremony. Though this time, I understood, the tears were not about kidneys or medical crises, but about genuine joy for the daughter she had, at long last, learned to see clearly. My relationship with my mother remains a work in progress, honestly, and I do not think that will ever fully resolve into something simple, because 26 years of conditioning does not unravel in a handful of hospital conversations. But we talk now, regularly, and she has, slowly, over the 2 years since Bryson's surgery, begun to acknowledge, unprompted, the specific harm she caused, rather than simply apologizing in vague, general terms. My relationship with Bryson has become the closest, most honest relationship of my life. Two people who survived the same impossible childhood, finally allowed to simply be siblings, rather than patient and donor, finally free to talk about football and bad reality television, and our shared, complicated grief for the family we might have had, rather than only ever talking about kidney function. I think about that folder on the kitchen table often, the one my mother slid across to me without asking, the one that told me, in the coldest possible language, exactly what my body meant to my family. And I think about the choice I eventually made, years later, to give my brother a piece of myself anyway, not because anyone scheduled it, not because I was born for it, but because I chose it, freely, as a whole person standing on her own 2 feet, thousands of miles from the house where I once believed my only value was hidden somewhere inside my own kidneys. That difference, between being harvested and choosing to give, has made all the difference in the world. And I would not trade the 3 years I spent finding myself in Lisbon for anything, because it was only by leaving that I ever learned I was worth more than the parts of me that could save someone else.